The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. The shepherds went with haste to Bethlehem and found Mary and Joseph and the child lying in the manger. When they saw this, they made known what had been told them about this child, and all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds told them. But Mary treasured all these words and pondered them in her heart. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all that they had heard and seen, as it had been told them. After 8 days had passed, it was time to circumcise the child, and he was called Jesus, the name given by the angel before he was conceived in the womb. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
I was browsing on Facebook last night while I was waiting to watch the ball drop from New York City, which was in its own way a very strange viewing because the normally packed Times Square was virtually empty. But anyways, as I was browsing, it seemed that there was a common sentiment that was expressed by a lot of my friends on Facebook. And that sentiment was, boy, am I sure glad that 2020 is over. And there were even some who went as far as to say, I'm ready to just forget that this whole year even happened and move on. And I can certainly understand where that sentiment is coming from, because we know that 2020 wasn't the easiest year. Perhaps first and foremost on everybody's mind, for the reason why, is the pandemic. But there are all sorts of other things that emerged in the midst of that pandemic that maybe we'd rather forget. Things like having to deal with loneliness and isolation and increased instances of mental illness as a result of that loneliness and isolation. Or even the way in which society's racial injustice presented itself in the midst of 2020. All of these things that happened are things that we would sooner like to be able to forget and just focus on good times ahead. But I think there's a danger in trying to forget a year and trying to act like it never happened. Because New Year's is not magic. When the clock struck midnight, all of those problems that occurred over the past year didn't magically go away. We woke up this morning and we're still in the grips of a pandemic, which we're likely to be for a while. We still haven't fully addressed the injustices that are present in our society. People are still suffering from loneliness and isolation. And nothing has changed just because we are in a new calendar year. So what do we do? And what can we learn? I think that this feast today gives us a powerful opportunity to look at Mary's life, to look at how she lived, and to live our lives accordingly as we try to respond to the year that has just happened. There's an old saying that says, when it comes to looking at the past, you can do one of two things. You can either try to run from it, or you can learn from it. And I would say that trying to run from it sometimes does more harm than good. But when we learn from our past, then we can see how we can move forward and how we can better live our lives according to the gospel of Christ. And that's a lesson that we see Mary demonstrating quite well in our gospel. Remember that most scholars think that when the events in our gospel took place surrounding the birth of Jesus, Mary was at most 14 or 15 years old. No offense to any of the high schoolers out there, but when I was 14 or 15 years old, I was clueless as to the ways of the world. And granted, Mary grew up in a different time when people by necessity had to mature much faster because lifespans were shorter and so on. But still, for a 14 or 15-year-old girl, to be visited by an angel, told that she was going to give birth to the Son of God, and then go through her pregnancy, finding out that her cousin was also pregnant, to have this child be born in a manger, and then to have these shepherds come in and say all of these wonderful things that angels had appeared to them and said about her son would be a lot to take in. Mary would no doubt have been confused by all of these occurrences, by this reality. And she would have probably wondered what it all meant. And she could have done one or two things. She could have just dismissed it and said, oh, it doesn't matter. I'm never going to understand it anyways. What's the point? Or she could do what we hear the gospel saying she did, which was to treasure these things and to ponder them in her heart. And it's the pondering in her heart that is important for each and every one of us. Because what she does by pondering is she reflects on the meaning and the significance of the words that were spoken to her, and she invites God into that situation to help open the eyes of her heart and open her mind to truly understand what is taking place, to truly understand the deeper meaning and the significance and the reality of the words spoken in this gospel. There's another time that this same message is repeated, and it's just a little bit later in Luke's gospel, after they find the child Jesus in the temple, talking with the teachers and asking them questions. And Jesus responds to her, "Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I would be in my Father's house?" And she didn't understand at the time what that meant, but she continued to ponder on it and reflect and ask God for that deeper wisdom and insight. And that, brothers and sisters, following Mary's example, is the lesson that we can take away not only from this feast, not only from Mary's own example of how she lived her life, but how we are called to respond to the year that has just ended. We don't understand a lot of the things that have happened. We don't understand why this pandemic took place, why so many instances of racism have cropped up throughout our world, why people are being forced into loneliness and isolation, although maybe that one's a little bit easier to see because of the pandemic. But we may not understand these things fully, but if we do reflect on them and ponder them and ask for God's guidance and help to learn from what we have just experienced, then we can move forward into this new year with that newfound sense of hope and find that way to live our lives more fully according to the gospel. There will still be challenging days ahead. There will still be struggles and difficulties. But when we face those difficulties with the Lord on our side, they will be easier to endure and manage and comprehend. So as we begin this new year, we pray for the Lord's blessings to come down upon each and every one of us, and we ask for his continued guidance and wisdom and strength so that we might learn whatever lessons he is calling us to learn from the experiences of 2020 and carry those lessons forward into the new year as we seek always to grow closer to God and to serve him more and more faithfully in all that we do.